Joining me now is Representative Marilyn Strickland of Washington. She's a member of the Armed Services Committee. Congresswoman, Ukrainian forces appear to have, they appear to be holding their own against the Russian troops' aggression in their capital city of Kyiv. Early U.S. intelligence indicated the city would fall in a matter of days, but that hasn't happened. Now, meanwhile, Russia has started bringing in reinforcements from Georgia and shifted their focus more on the country's east region, suggesting a new phase in the war. What's your assessment on how Ukrainian forces are doing in defending themselves against Russia, and what do you make of this new phase in the war?
Well, thank you for having me on, Reverend Sharpton, and you are correct. When this war started a month ago now, the conventional wisdom was that Kyiv would fall in a matter of days. And Kyiv is still standing strong because the Ukrainian people are just resolute and they are going to defend their homeland. So you see Russia changing tacks now and heading toward the east. But I also want to point out, too, that, President Biden was in Poland. He's there with the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, and they are, demonstrating that NATO remains unified and resolute. The Congress did pass $13 billion of aid for Ukraine for humanitarian and for equipment. The president approved $800 million, and there's a first tranche of that money coming. And so, we knew that this war was going to be long and protracted, but at the same time, the Ukrainians are holding their own.
Earlier today, President Biden called out Vladimir Putin for his attempt to divide NATO. Here's what he had to say.
I'm confident that Vladimir Putin was counting on being able to divide NATO, to be able to separate the eastern flank from the west, be able to separate nations based on past histories. But he hadn't been able to do it. We've all stayed together. And so I just think it's so important that we, Poland and the United States, keep in lockstep in how we're proceeding.
Now, this comes days after all 30 NATO countries issued a joint statement condemning Russia's war and vowed to provide assistance to Ukraine. Now, Biden also expressed support of expelling Russia from the G20 and said NATO would respond if Russia used chemical weapons inside Ukraine. Do you think Putin will heed the pressure from the West? And how concerned are you with the possibility of U.S. troops fighting in the war?
So the U.S. has no intention of declaring a no-fly zone or putting U.S. troops on the ground. Remember, Reverend, we just pulled out of Afghanistan, a long and protracted war, but we stand united with our NATO allies. And I think this is the whole point of the president's visit, along with his secretaries of defense and secretary of state. And I think it's important, too, to remember that, we are supplying humanitarian aid. We are providing hardware. We're doing what we can to really provide major assistance to Ukraine along with our allies. And you're right, at the top of the segment, it talked about how, Putin was counting on NATO being divided, and maybe he's living in a bubble because that is the opposite of what's happening. Secretary Blinken laid the groundwork to really go on tour and remind folks that the United States stands with its NATO allies. Vice President Harris put in a lot of work to do that. And as you see with the fighting happening in Ukraine, NATO stands beside Ukraine. We are going to support them every way we can and do what we can to make sure that, Vladimir Putin is pushed back.
Now, let's switch gears a little to the confirmation hearing on Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. This week, Republican senators had their racist and sexist attacks on full display. The political spectacle included Lindsey Graham's questions about Judge Jackson's faith to pander to the predominantly white evangelical base. And then we had Josh Hawley's accusations that Jackson is somehow soft on criminals who traffic child pornography. Then Ted Cruz trying to connect Jackson to critical race theory. That's only a few examples. How do you interpret these attacks on this qualified judge who happens to be a black woman? How well did Senate Democrats defend the nominee and debunk the character assassination by the right?
Well, it's no surprise that they were going to take that route. They were going to try to turn this into a three-ring circus, and I would say they failed miserably. If you look at Judge Jackson's credentials compared to those who she will be serving with, she has so many more than most people do. She has been a federal judge. She has been a public defender. And the Senate Judiciary Committee has seen her already 4 times. In a bipartisan manner, they have appointed her already to the federal court. And so we knew that these attacks would come. And this is the reality of being a Black woman in America when you're aspiring to do big things. We knew that the racism would come out. We knew the sexism would come out. And I'm not surprised at what they were saying. However, you know, the attempt to characterize her as soft on crime fell flat. And here's why. The Fraternal Order of Police have endorsed Judge Jackson. The International Association of Police Chiefs have endorsed her. They would not endorse someone who's soft on crime. So they can keep trying to malign her character. But, you know, she very, very thoughtfully maintaining her composure, sticks to the facts. And in many cases, you know, these unsubstantiated attacks and their feeble attempts to discredit her really demonstrate that this is not the flex they thought it was.
Yeah, no, she epitomized grace under fire and real dignity. There's no question about that. And it was certainly racist as they went after her in many ways, trying to criminalize her, which is the stereotype they put on blacks. Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, thank you for being with us.